When we cover Disney live-action films, we sadly ignore the other half that consists of original content. And what I mean by this is films that were first conceived as live-action and were not remakes of their own beloved animated films that everyone already knew about. Because we have covered too many of that on a negative side, where I wanted to be more open-minded about what I do now and what I always wanted to do when I thought about covering most Disney content. Because live action still is a crucial part of Disney whether you like it or not. Thinking of classic films like Mary Poppins that remains to be a staple today that also continued to trend when Disney first started using real actors in animated films. In fact, most of my nostalgia does come from the wacky early 2000s era of Disney live-action films that you can watch on Disney Plus today, airing on multiple TV networks or ones I actually watched in theaters themselves. With the greatest example of such films includes the likes of Enchanted back in 2007 that starred Amy Adams in a role that would solidify her in a lead status over the years and one that paid tribute to the Disney legacy within animation and live-action moving on to a newer generation. It was a general success at the time, making over $340 million and praised for being a film that parodies itself within the combination of both live action and animation together, being a great story in allowing any person to discover what they truly want. A film that is pleasant to all without catering specifically to certain groups or ideas that proves the usefulness of having both mediums together in existence, rather than making one thing over the other as the lesson they didn't learn now. An actual film that represents the nostalgia they were always so desperate in looking for in the modern age. Where the reason I wanted to take a look back on this film now is because it has been over 2 years since the sequel was released, which was nothing short but a disappointment, and still continued the same trend they're facing now with every sequel they released. Of course, I was happy they decided to use 2D animation in that film to continue the legacy forward, but that still didn't solve the problems that make this film a mediocre mess that lacks what Enchanted was all about and why this film works so well. And looking back upon Enchanted nowadays is like finding a diamond in the rough, a perfect movie of its type that deserves such continued recognition to this day, and for me to cover on the basis of the best that Disney live action can really say when it's left to its own creative minds. With the best fact above all was that it was in fact directed by Kevin Lima, who did Goofy Movie and Tarzan, where I think he just had the pulse for creating something in between animation and live action that understands fairy tales and pop culture as I see it, with those movies playing out the way that they did. Where you are faced with a character like Giselle, born in this whimsical fairy tale world but then transported to the modern setting of real world in New York City, with a cynical father named Robert raising his daughter Morgan. Two characters that are vastly different in terms of their wants or understandings of the world being either positive or negative, but also very similar in what they really need. And also having a great side cast of characters too, like James Marsden playing the ever so charming Prince Edward, Susan Sarandon playing the evil Queen Nerissa, Edward's stepmom, and of course Idina Menzel as Nancy, who doesn't even sing at all in this film, taking another 6 years before she has her chance with Disney's Frozen, and of course until the sequel back in 2022. But overall, you get what I mean when you have a charming cast delivering such a charming movie that ages wonderfully with any audience type, and one we should get in right to exploring as a lively Disney classic. Now, Enchanted, as that Disney tribute you would expect it to be, starts like any other fairy tale, opening the pages with narration by Julie Andrews, introducing us to the kingdom of Andalasia, ruled by the evil Queen Nerissa, who wants to hold on to her power by any desperate means possible before her stepson ever gets married and takes over the throne as a result. As we could see here, their characters are obvious parallels to Snow White, with Edward taking both roles of Snow White herself and the prince, while his own stepmother is of course based upon the evil queen, who we will eventually see her transform into an old hag and have more power similar to older Disney villains, like notably being a crossover between the evil queen and Maleficent. And then we finally get introduced to Giselle, a maiden who lives in the forest with the animals and dreams solely of true love. As you can tell on her side, she is also inspired by Snow White, and by extent most of the other Disney princesses before and quite possibly after her, when they include where they are in their life and where they should end up being. That in the initial stages of the film, we are going to get into something we should already expect in the age-old Disney fairy tale that we love, and clearly within the parallels to its older work and references that prove that there is something else at play. That is, of course, if you really didn't spoil yourself of any trailers at the time, knowing you would be transported to the real world and the modern age. But for the time being, we are just now in the world of Giselle's simple want, describing true love's kiss in a song while Nathaniel, the queen's servant, tries to prevent the Prince Edward from finding out, which we know, because of what kind of storybook we are in, that just never works out, and they do meet and automatically fall in love with that typical Disney love romance, just like we already reached the ending of Snow White before turning our back to the queen who's desperate to stop her. And before I continue, I also forgot to comment that I like how they did animate the characters to the actors themselves, basing their animated image off of their real image so the story can get a big boost to how we expect these animators to portray them as, and more importantly how Kevin Lima wanted Enchanted to have its own style, because Disney Animation at the time had all but completely shut down their traditional animation operations, laying off most of the 2D staff regrettably. The animation was just done here by another studio formed by one of their old former animators to make the 13 minutes of this film possible, where yes, it really is only 13 minutes out of the entire 107-minute runtime, which still makes sense because we're meant to be transported back to our own lives. But back to the point at hand, the style of the animation for the characters was based not on just the actors themselves, they were, but also the feeling of it. Like Giselle here will both be a cross of Amy Adams and what a classic Disney princess would be, where Prince Edward will be more lively looking like James Marsden since most of the stories with Prince apparently were bland, and then so on with the others so they can match with the real costume designs as much as you could say that this is what would happen if they were real people. And going back to the story at the current point, it's where like Cinderella, Giselle attempts to make it for her wedding since we got done with the whole forest part of the journey. Her appearance is now matching another Disney story, but also matched within the disguise of old Nerissa, who attempts to still drag her away and move her back into Snow White. The strangest thing about all of this is in fact Giselle's own eagerness to get married right away. Like we only just spent a few minutes getting to know her, and now she's like willy-nilly getting wanted to get it done as fast as possible, showing us the obvious parody side of this story, but also not much to our own character quite yet. That in one way, we're getting informed much about Giselle's character even though there's not much to base off of, being still based upon those fairy tale books you read as a child that doesn't quite know what life is really like. And that's where Nerissa gets to drag her into the story with the magical well under the pretense of granting wishes like you know what Disney would do when you wish upon a star. I mean, this movie proclaims to have thousands of Disney references itself in it, and we can clearly see that happening at every turn right now in the animated sequence, but for this I'm just gonna say we will focus on the big ones that relates to our current story. The point of starting Giselle wishing for a happily ever after, which she grants in the opposite direction with the place that doesn't have it at all, which we all know is obviously New York City. This is where we see thousands of sparkling dust surround her and finally get to transform her into dreaded live action, upside down into the bustling city that feels so oppressive in comparison to a forest filled with woodland creatures who can sing. And once again, I have to give credit to anyone who's never watched the trailers or never watched the film until they probably saw it pop up on Disney+, including now and especially back then when it comes to films, because it just creates this great shock factor where you find the characters in a very surprising or unfamiliar setting you'd expect. Like you first thought this would have been an animated film, but now it's something different. Like Giselle looking at her real self, and then New York where everyone stands to question her appearance below a sewer. And automatically, she gets pulled into the chaos of New Yorkers with cars, mistaking midgets for other storybook people until she gets out to the other end of the subway, only for a homeless guy to steal her tiara before it rains down. It's the perfect way to introduce the idea of a place that doesn't have happily ever afters when you go into the real world from your life that was literally a fantasy world setting. And I've got to say, for this scene alone and for the rest of the film, Amy Adams does a real fantastic job performing that same animated version of herself, not knowing where she is, going about it like she was this real fairy tale character with that voice and face of awe and straight utter confusion. The way she portrays Giselle is exactly how you would truly envision a princess to be like. Not a real princess obviously if you think of that, but you get what I'm saying in the terms of the animated movie. In the meantime, we are also finally introduced to Robert, who is a divorce attorney and raises his young daughter after his wife left them. An interesting type of story for a character we never really get to see often, including in the likes of Disney stories that pair a young girl and a young boy getting their happily ever after, with one who clearly is the opposite and already had a bad ending with a wife and is more on the cynical side of it. But the greatest thing you will notice right here about Robert is that his secretary Sam is played by none other than Jodie Benson herself. Because yes, you heard it right, Alongside references to other Disney moments, we actually have the Disney actors themselves like Ariel, who is not just the only princess in this film. And the reason to mention this, besides being a Disney princess cameoing or acting overall in this film, is the fact of what they are portraying. Typical people like you and me working for law firms or other jobs in society that is clearly different from the characters that we knew them as princesses or in this fantasy world of like Andalasia. What we will know Giselle for in paying tribute to that fact that will come down later the line and separating the distinction between fiction and reality. So later on when he drives home with his daughter, they finally get to meet Giselle, since Morgan likes fairy tales and believes in princesses, trying to get out to help before she falls off the billboard. They then finally get to take her back to their place, where we get to see him initially think that she is a very troubled woman, acting very strange, thinking of true love's kiss. Just this random girl who is acting like life is supposed to be easy or happy when that's not the case of how it really plays out in our minds, and where Robert only reluctantly agrees to have her stay at the behest of her daughter, who still believes in what she says she is. On the other hand, back in the kingdom of Andalasia, Edward finds out about what happened to Giselle and goes down the well alongside the squirrel Pip to rescue his fair maiden. We find out to be 10 times worse than Giselle, believing in the fairy tale world like you would normally picture, since again, Prince characters weren't fully fleshed out in the early days, and he is obviously a parody to those types of characters. Not that his entire personality could be based on the fact, but clearly inspired by how his own reactions to the real world are just to go after people or things with his sword when it comes to buses, thinking they are monsters or whatever the heck he thinks this place is, and how squirrels cannot talk in the real world because it is a place that is less magical, but showing a stark contrast to the rules of the worlds that they inhabit, forcing another method of communication for a character who is used to his own particular speech, which of course affects Nerissa's plans again, where she has to send Nathaniel to deal with him in the process, going around places like New York City to try to stop the both of them whenever he has the chance. But going back to our main characters is where we first get our main song in the real world, the Happily Little Working Song, where you get introduced to the idea of bringing these animated musicals to life. The question of what if it existed in a very real setting where they actually had a combination of CGI and real animals working in the scene, which is quite impressive for the time that manages to stay relevant and better than most live action film CGI work for some reason. And while dealing with Giselle, with her still singing and attempting to get her new clothes in the city, we finally get introduced to Robert's girlfriend Nancy Tremaine, who he was going to propose as he stated earlier to his secretary. Now unfortunately having his world flip upside down with Giselle in the picture, which doesn't go well and adds to new problems for someone who's already settling in the divorce side of business. So now you see the story forming between his definition of knowing that true love doesn't exist when you have reactions like Nancy, who he serves rather than Giselle, who's just happily waiting for it to all come true, which he personally cannot take, trying to find out where she lived and try to send her back. Because after all, she did make a dress out of his own curtains, so who wouldn't think this lady's deranged and needs to get sent back to wherever the hell they came from. So he brings her back to work and tries to get Ariel herself to find out where she's been from, while also expressing utter confusion when she carried a fish from the tank in her mouth. This scene is funny for the fact, again, it's Jodie Benson in this scene, finding out this film's princess origin of Andalasia that she cannot find while she actually dances next to a fish tank with an instrumental version of Part of Your World playing in the background. So alongside these physical references, you also get the musical references obviously to Disney's past with the actual characters involved, combining worlds of parody and whimsy with real world dynamics. Also paired with the fact that Nathaniel has to carry out the Queen's will of trying to poison Giselle and stop Prince Edward, who Pip tries to communicate with as much as possible, to his frustration of not even understanding. Like, we clearly know what he's trying to say by his own portrayals, but someone like Prince Edward unfortunately does not have the benefit of understanding anything what his peanut-sized brain could think. But as we get to know Giselle more, she also gets to know the world and the negatives that come with it, dealing with the divorcing couple, whom she cannot comprehend don't love each other anymore. That makes her upset while she points out the good that they have in each other. That unfortunately freaks everyone out and makes Robert's boss mad as he tries to finally set her straight on her way, but also gets a little conflicted in his own mind due to her kind nature, finding the old lady on the bus that Edward was on, literally in this situation, where in his eye, there's just something about this girl that feels quite different, thinking she can madly fall in love with someone within a single day, and marrying them and spending the rest of their life in a happily ever after. Robert's character is obviously entering our own experience of how people really are. You just can't madly fall in love with someone you just met or marry them the same day because you just don't know them well enough. Something that feels quite ironic, speaking of, at the end of the movie, and of course a character like Nancy played by Indina Menzel would then play another character stating the same thing about her sister who would try to go with. But Robert, on the other hand, tries to introduce Giselle to the idea of real world like dating, knowing someone like Nancy for 5 years at this point rather than just one day, and how she questions how does she know? How does she truly know if he in fact loves her? Within, of course, the song, That's How You Know. And this is where we finally have to talk about the film's soundtrack once again, done by the legendary Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz, who both worked together on films like Pocahontas and Hunchback of Notre Dame during the Renaissance era. This made much sense for them to do, considering that entire era and the introduction of Alan Menken composing more of the live-action films was something they wanted to do. But in the case of trying to do something different in blending animation into reality, where you have to balance the music in a way that makes sense to some degree, but also comedically questionable in the eyes of those like Robert, which songs like this represents. Because just like the film itself, the song is a bit of a parody of Disney musicals while also being a tribute to the work Menken and Howard Ashman did in this grand scale. Like, it works so well in the context of the film and the environment they're in, like Central Park, with a flash mob of cultures coming together with different people jamming it out. The purpose of showing Robert that you can show true love and how you can really feel coming from a fairy tale perspective in a real setting, where you can find hints of other Disney works like Belle or even Under the Sea if you look closely at the details. And having all these dancers dressed like regular New Yorkers in any occupation just does hit the great point of what Disney is, or what it feels like to people with the emotions it displays. The movie just does a great job at servicing all the positives about it in any form, and it truly works, with the Dove sending Nancy flowers to make some amends about the earlier incident that showed a little bit of love can actually go a long way, while Prince Edward, on the other hand, has to deal with Nathaniel's distractions trying to be dragged away from finding her unsuccessfully, and how his Apple schemes are just not working to appear as every cultural stereotype in New York City. This part is where we also get another cameo by a familiar face, that being Paige O'Hara, Belle herself, starring in the soap opera that Nathaniel seems intrigued by, thinking of his own character with the relationship with Nerissa and what she does think of him. This one is short and sweet in terms of its relationship regarding to cameos that is different from Jodie Benson's in the manner that it takes another character's interactions from a screen showing a different side of things, one that widely differs from Belle herself and her own nature, disregarding other men, then going with the beast, and then going back with Nathaniel's own use by Nerissa in this sense. All the while you still have Pip trying his best to tell Edward what is happening with the poison apples, but still failing. But in the meantime, after the events of the day, Robert takes Giselle out with his daughter Morgan to this restaurant, almost appearing like a date that she finally understands herself and genuinely likes what he is showing her. It's also a scene where we kinda discuss what happened with his wife and Morgan's mother, and why true love can only be a fantasy for him because she left, not wanting to deal with them anymore for some reason, and that clearly affected his life raising his own daughter by himself. Yet how she always tries to contrast that with the fact that maybe they do come true like all fairy tales, because she does love talking to Robert and finding out what he's like personally, similar to the earlier discussions of what a date was and where that leads to know someone and eventually love someone, that we finally see in some form Giselle is growing as a person, but stopped yet again by the antics of Nathaniel, now disguised as another stereotype as an Italian, giving a martini, an apple martini with the apples, yet stopped again by Pip, who tries to warn her, but the chaos getting out of hand and they have to leave. Yet the main point of this scene of the film is where Giselle and Robert get to spend more time with each other out there and back at his place with their own clashing definitions, the persistence to believe in fairy tale stories or grim realities of fate, enough to the point where she finally, for the first time, gets angry, an expression she was probably never even created to believe in when she comes from a place like Andalasia, all stemming from the conflicting points of view that doesn't want to admit the real truth, as we see her expressing shock and excitement with this emotion that she's never felt before, and which by extent feeling Robert, secretly showing us the underlying feelings that both may have about each other, growing and knowing others on the side of either understanding finally that love is more than what meets the eye, or just seeing that it can exist far beyond the pain we can experience. And the next day is filled with rewards when Edward finally finds Giselle to confirm the happy endings on her part that does actually exist, but also at a time where she herself has grown as a person, not even attempting to finish the duet that he initially sang to her. That last night actually taught her plenty of things, especially how to probably feel in terms of her growth of her character, not just as a character but a real human being that exists outside what is written, wanting to finally go on a date want with the prince to know more about each other and the world as a whole. A feeling where she cannot let Robert off of her chest, and neither can he, in some way that transformed their lives to be totally different, at the cost of making Nerissa angry that they eventually got back together, and unfortunately wants to make her do things herself, which I guess in some form is a reference to no matter how hard a villain tries, you will always get to the happy ending in the case of any Disney story. I also forgot to add, like when Edwards was looking for Giselle in the building after the incident of Pip, he got caught up in this apartment building, also finding another cameo with a woman raising these kids, who is in fact played by Judy Kuhn, who also did the singing voice of Pocahontas, just to add more Disney princess references that still exist in the film with most of the smallest of scenes. Like, you gotta believe me when I say that this film really did go all out on making this greatest Disney tribute ever for its time, and the greatest thing about it is how Giselle's impact on the world is felt with the divorcing couple deciding actually not to go through with that divorce and rekindle their own love, realizing that everyone in the world has problems of their own, there's no escaping that side of life, but how they won't let it sacrifice the good that you do have, that it always outweighs the bad within their own experience, and you shouldn't give that up if love actually exists. Again, this film is not just for Giselle to grow into a person of her own, but also for people like Robert to realize that true love does actually exist in the world, and you only have to open yourself to try and find it. And finding that she also wants to go to the ball with Edwards before they go back because she feels that there is so much more this world has to offer, or more secretly in her case that she does love Robert. So she goes back and enlists Morgan's help to wear a new dress, and opens up conversations of dealing with a new mother that both never actually had in their life, obviously transposed with Nerissa appearing in the next scene. And a quick side note right here is where I would like to point out that Nerissa is very knowledgeable about the real world itself, knowing it as the place where happily ever afters never actually exist, and doesn't express shock at her surroundings like Giselle or Edward being confused when they first came in, and her interactions with Nathaniel, who also has some knowledge about how things work in this world, giving her an edge as a villain that knows what she is dealing with mostly. Which she eventually in this scene finds Nathaniel and takes over his job to where Giselle and Robert would be at that very ball, the last chance at staying in power for however long that might have lasted, and how that culminates in this grand beautiful appearance as Giselle as a proper lady with Prince Edward to the shock of Robert and the mixed feelings of everyone else who yearns to have a dance. And with this is the introduction of the most beautiful scene or even song in the film, being so close. This song also has become quite popular within Disney itself, choosing to use the romantic ballad as an emotional point for their theme park shows like World of Color and Luminous when it comes to the idea of love itself, which is a great recognition for a film like this to be regarded in the Disney library, written by Menken and Schwartz. The great part of this song is how it relates to the music itself becoming more contemporary, as Giselle transitions into a woman of her own like a regular modern individual, representing that feeling that both characters had that also Edward and Nancy realizes to a degree. This can also be said earlier with That's How You Know coming off a happy little working song that tributes itself back to Snow White, and then gradually becomes more real as you get introduced to the circumstances and instruments to express their points, crossing over between classic Disney animated features and modern pop ballads that So Close attempts to show. That it was based upon the title song of Beauty and the Beast itself, when both Belle and Beast dance and realize their own love of each other in some form. Now modernized in the case of having it performed by singer John McLaughlin, where it also became one of the 3 songs nominated for Best Original Song at the Oscars. It kind of surprised me that it initially got negative reviews for being too slow, but in the context of the story, it was just so perfect, with the song itself representing both characters being together, yet so far apart as characters from different worlds. Like they have each other right now where they are now, but they also have the loved ones of their own life and the story that is not yet finished as the song is trying to represent, cutting in as they could never really be truly together when Edwards takes her back up before they get home to Andalusia, where Nerissa, of course once again, appears to Giselle as that same old lady from earlier that sent her straight down, convincing her that happy endings cannot always exist and she can stop the pain of not dealing with her true real love before they go away. The final ultimate Snow White tribute, where she does take the bite before her stepson realizes what is happening, trying to save face in this situation to stop him from doing anything crazy before the entire ball takes notice and Robert and Nancy go try to help before Nathaniel reveals the truth that she poisoned her with the apples. And the only thing that can be done is actually in fact true love's kiss, as Robert realizes. Where within this realization also comes the fact that Prince Edward is not the one to do it, immediately knowing that it is Robert who must save the day. Of course, first hesitant because it's been a few days, but also knowing that everything up to this point within his own heart and to the agreement of Nancy is in fact that it is him, that this is where his heart truly lies. And it actually does work to no surprise, and she does exclaim herself that she knew it was him all along in a short happy victory before Nerissa decides to take matters into her own hands to reveal her true power to mess things up, finally referencing Maleficent by turning into a dragon and forcing them to try to save him at all costs. And you probably know the rest of what happens here when they try to save him, with the typical villain falling down to their death and the day is saved once again, where real true love is finally formed, where happily ever afters can actually happen to everyone involved, including here in the real world of New York City, and to Nancy, who takes up Edward's offer with the Cinderella reference of the slipper, taking her to marry in the kingdom of Andalasia, which in a way is kinda nice. It works out to the reverse side of things, where although you don't get the guy you dated for 5 years, you can actually choose to spend an eternity with the prince you just met an hour ago in the realm of 2D animation. So that's a win-win in my book with both perspectives of this film, where we see Nathaniel become a best-selling author in the real world like Pip did back home, and Giselle opening a new fashion business, living a wonderful life with Robert and Morgan, until the sequel tries to make some form of tension come up, of course. But the true experience of Enchanted is one of great passion for the history of Disney storytelling, tributing and parodying its best while celebrating its future. For we can have stories that can break ground in the real world to show us what true love can mean, solving our differences when we get to slow down and know each other rather than wipe it out of our minds completely. That we can grow at any age to understand what others are like, to learn to love and be loved in the pinnacle of what stories connects to all of us. The only regret it could have was probably its successor not really capturing what worked well in regards to why that movie isn't so great, and only continue a problem of Disney prolonging things they don't need and capitalizing without truly understanding the thematic messages at play. But when we do, we create things like Enchanted, and Enchanted still remains to be timeless as ever, even while it takes place in a certain time period, going from fantasy to modern 2007 era New York. And it is my hope that more generations will be introduced to see it that way, as we will all live happily ever after.